They had dragged her into the town square like she was a sack of spoiled grain, not a girl with a name, a heart, and a mother's wedding dress still clinging to her skin. Raella didn't cry when the first bucket of mud hit her chest, nor when the second one soaked through her skirt. It wasn't until they ripped the locket from her neck and tossed it into the trough that her lip trembled. The sheriff stood with arms folded, making no move to stop the Baker brothers, her in-laws by marriage, now her executioners by shame. Liar, they called her, cheater, Jeb's whore, and finally, you're not Vale blood. The last one cut deeper than the gravel beneath her knees. She had nothing left to say. Her husband was dead, killed in a cattle stampede a month after their rushed wedding, and now they blamed her for his death. She should have run when she heard them riding up the trail, but she'd stayed, believing decency might win. Foolish girl. Raella felt the cold mud on her back as they pushed her face first into the dirt, her hair matted, her dress ruined. Crawl, then, one sneered. Crawl to someone who wants a filthy widow. She didn't know why she looked toward the edge of the square, but when she did, she saw him. Bo Hartley, the loner rancher who never spoke unless it was to a horse or God. He stood with a bundle of fence posts in one hand and a steel gaze that cut cleaner than any blade. For a second, she thought he'd turn away like the rest. But he dropped the posts, walked, step after step through silence. No sheriff stopped him. No townsfolk dared speak. And when he reached her, kneeling in the muck, Raelle raised her face just enough to whisper, "Can you still hug me?" Her voice cracked on the word still, as if she knew she'd become untouchable. He didn't answer, just unbuttoned his duster coat, dropped it around her shoulders, and lifted her like a child too broken to stand. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Baker brothers stepped forward, but Bo turned his back to them, cradling her with the reverence of a man holding something sacred. Not a word, not a glance, just quiet defiance. As he walked, Raella let her head fall against his chest and felt, for the first time in days, warmth. The town square vanished behind them, but the memory of what she'd asked lingered in the air. And though Bo had said nothing, the way he held her answered everything. People would talk, twist it, judge it. But Bo didn't care for gossip. He only cared for broken things, wounded animals, half-frozen colts, and now her. His boots left a trail of muddy water behind him, the coat around her shoulders growing heavier with each step. But Raella didn't move. She stayed still in his arms, her fingers curled against his shirt, afraid even a breath might shatter the moment. He passed the church, the smithy, the old schoolhouse with windows boarded up from a windstorm 2 summers back, and still he did not stop. Only when they reached the edge of the field, his field, did he pause, and say in a voice so low it nearly vanished, "You're not filthy, Raelle." It was the first time she'd heard her name spoken with anything but hate since Jeb died. And with that, the shaking in her shoulders finally gave way to quiet sobs, not from pain, but from something dangerously close to relief. Bo didn't take her to the house right away. Instead, he carried her past the barn, through the shadow of the leaning windmill, and into the tack shed behind the corral, where the scent of leather and old hay made her eyes sting again. He set her down gently on a wooden bench, then turned his back like a man more afraid of decency than desire. Raella clutched the coat tighter, suddenly aware of how exposed she looked. Mud streaked up her thighs, her wedding dress ripped and wilted like a drowned flower. "There's a pail and pump behind you," Bo said without turning. His voice was quiet, low like thunder you feel before you hear. "Ain't warm, but it'll rinse off the worst of it." Raella didn't move. Her hands shook too badly to grip the coat's buttons, and her throat felt like gravel. Bo waited. She could hear him shifting his weight, the floorboard creaking beneath his boots. When she finally stood, barefoot on the cold wood, she half expected him to leave. But he didn't. Just stared at the wall, jaw clenched, hands at his sides. She pumped the handle, the water icy and clean. It hit her skin in waves, washing away clumps of shame, sweat, and spit, and still he didn't look. Not even when she gasped from the cold. She scrubbed until the water ran clear, then sank back onto the bench, breathless, wet, and shivering. Bo took off his flannel and draped it over her shoulders without a word. "Why did you come?" she asked finally, voice ragged. "Why pick me up in front of everyone?" He stood still for a long while before answering. "'Cause you were the only one not crying." She blinked. "What?" "You didn't cry, Rael. You looked him in the eye. You bled pride." That wasn't true. She'd broken. She'd begged. But something in his voice made her believe he saw her different than she saw herself. "You could have just walked away," she whispered. "Like the rest." "Could have," he said. "Didn't." He knelt beside her then, pulling a folded cloth from his back pocket. Slowly, carefully, he wiped at a dried streak of mud under her eye, his thumb trembling just slightly. "They called me the devil's wife," she said. "Said the baby was cursed." He paused. "You pregnant?" "No." Her voice cracked. "That's the thing. Jeb and I, we never even—" She couldn't finish. Bo didn't flinch. "They lied." "Course they did." She smiled bitterly. "Doesn't change what folks think." He leaned back on his heels. "I don't care what folks think." "Then what do you care about, Bo Hartley?" His eyes, dark and endless, met hers for the first time since the square. "I care about silence," he said, "and the things it hides." That made her heart jump, because her silence hadn't saved her. It had buried her deeper. And now this man, this quiet rancher, was unearthing pieces of her no one else had dared to touch. Outside, a hawk screeched. The wind shifted. He stood, walked to the door, and opened it just enough to let light spill in. "You can stay here till you get your strength," he said. "Then you tell me where you want to go." She pulled the flannel tighter around her frame. "What if I don't know yet?" Bo nodded slowly. "Then you stay until you do." He stepped out, pulling the door half shut behind him. And Raelle, still wet and wrapped in a stranger's kindness, finally allowed herself to breathe without fear. But somewhere deep in her chest, something dangerous had begun to flicker. The hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. Raelle awoke the next morning to the sound of horses snorting and the steady rhythm of boots on frozen ground. The coat was still wrapped around her shoulders, warm from where she'd curled up on the cot Bo had left behind. There was a folded wool blanket over her legs, too. She hadn't heard him come back in, but somehow she knew it was him. When she stepped outside, blinking against the bright prairie sun, she saw him near the corral, splitting wood with clean, practiced swings. He didn't turn when she approached. "Thought I might help," she said, though her hands were still trembling from yesterday. Bo handed her a tin cup of coffee instead. "You don't lift an axe till you eat. Rule 1. She smiled faintly. "And Rule 2? "Don't try to outrun a storm," he said, tossing another log onto the stump. "It'll catch you tired." They sat in silence while she drank, the coffee scalding but welcome. Her hands ached from the heat, from the memory of being cold and covered in filth, from trying to hold herself together in front of a town that had already decided she was trash. "I used to think being quiet kept me safe," she said, watching steam rise. "But it just made them louder." Bo finally looked at her, his eyes slow and deliberate. You weren't quiet yesterday. She remembered the square, the spit in her hair, the way they'd screamed names while Jeb stood smirking near the gallows his father used to oversee. I wanted to scream back, she whispered. I wanted to grab the preacher's Bible and tear it in half. You should have, Bo muttered. Would have been a better sermon than he gave. She looked at him, surprised by the steel in his voice. There was something under Bo's calm, some scar deeper than his silence let on. What did you lose? She asked before she could stop herself. His jaw clenched. What makes you think I lost something? Because men like you don't carry other people's pain unless they've already buried their own. For a moment, Bo didn't move. Then he picked up a piece of wood, split it, and set it aside like the question hadn't been asked at all. 3 winters back, he said finally, my sister tried to come home. She was living in Topeka, married to a banker. Something happened, she wouldn't say, but she showed up here bruised and carrying a baby that wasn't his. Rayleigh's breath caught. What happened? Folks didn't believe her, said she was filthy, ungrateful, said she must have done something wrong. She only stayed a week after she left. He stopped. No one's heard from her since. Rayleigh swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. He turned toward the barn then. You want to earn your keep? Saddle the gray gelding? We've got fence to mend up north. She nodded, grateful for the task. For the first time in weeks, someone needed her. And it didn't matter that she was broken. She grabbed a bridle and followed him toward the stalls, her bare feet now wrapped in cloth scraps he'd left for her at the door. Bo? She asked softly. He stopped, one hand on the gate. You never said Rule 3. He looked at her over his shoulder, a glimmer of something almost like a smile touching the edge of his mouth. Don't let other people's rot take root in you, he said. It grows fast. And just like that, Rael realized she hadn't just been rescued. She'd been offered a different kind of law. One made not of punishment, but quiet rules written in kindness and pain. The ride north was slow, mostly silent, and filled with the kind of raw morning wind that cut through even the thickest wool. Raella rode behind Bo on the gray gelding, her hands gripping the saddle horn, cloth-wrapped feet tucked tight against the stirrups. Every bump jostled her sore bones, but she didn't complain. Bo didn't speak unless it was about the land, how the soil turned brittle this time of year, how the cattle kept breaking the same stretch of fence along the ridge. She watched him in profile as he rode, the way his shoulders moved with the horse, how he always kept one eye scanning the horizon like he was waiting for something more dangerous than barbed wire. When they reached the break, she slid off the horse and began gathering posts like he showed her, stacking them beside the old rails. He handed her pliers, then started digging in silence. The work was hard and dirty, but different than what she knew. This kind of dirt didn't stick like shame. It washed off. Her hands blistered, and at one point she let out a sharp yelp when a nail bit too deep. Bo didn't coddle her, just tore a strip of fabric from his own sleeve and wrapped her palm with practiced hands. You always carry bandages? She asked, breathless. Number just keep ripping shirts. He didn't smile, but she saw something in his eyes. Warmth, or maybe worry, or maybe the memory of someone else's blood? She sat back on her heels, watching him hammer in the next stake. Your sister, she said, her voice low. Was her baby a girl or a boy? Girl, he said after a pause. Named her Esme. Raella stared down at her lap. That's beautiful. Bo stopped working. You don't have to talk, you know. Not about what happened. I do, she said quickly. Not for you, for me. Otherwise it'll keep rotting inside. She looked up at him, her voice trembling but sure. Jeb said he loved me. He made me believe it. And when I told him I was with child, he told me I was filthy, that I'd been with others. He laughed in my face. And when I cried, he said tears were a poor woman's perfume. Bo didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her. His father's the sheriff, she continued, and the preacher's his uncle. They called it fornication. They said I was trying to trap him, that I'd shamed the church. They kicked me out of the boarding house, tore my things, took the baby's blanket and burned it. She looked at her hands, now raw and shaking. Then they made me walk through the town square, covered me in mud like I was some kind of plague, said I needed to be seen so no one else would fall for my lies. Bo's jaw tightened, fists clenched so hard around the hammer that his knuckles turned bone white. "Where's the child now?" "Gone," she whispered. "I lost it the day before they humiliated me." She didn't cry. She'd already run dry. But Bo reached over slowly and set the hammer down between them. Then he sat beside her in the dirt, shoulder to shoulder, and said nothing at all. Just breathed with her, like her presence wasn't filth, like her silence wasn't broken. And when she closed her eyes, for the first time in weeks, she didn't see faces twisted in judgment. She saw fence posts, hands wrapping her wound, a saddle waiting by the barn. "You know," she murmured, "you're not what I expected." Bo glanced at her sideways. "What did you expect? A man with silence like yours?" She exhaled. "I figured you'd bury my pain too." Bo shook his head. "I don't bury truth. I just wait till it's strong enough to stand." Bo hadn't meant to open the ledger again. It was buried under a pile of horse tack and oilcloth, tucked in the back corner of the barn where old ghosts went to sleep. But after hearing Raele's story beside the broken fence, something in him itched, some suspicion that had gnawed at the edges of his mind for months, but never found a place to land. He waited until Raele had gone to sleep in the cot by the stove, her breathing soft and even beneath the borrowed quilt, before he lit a lantern and fetched the book. It was an old ranch ledger, half filled with grazing counts and water rights, mostly scribbled in the neat script of Bo's father. But near the middle, starting 2 winters ago, the handwriting changed. It was scratchier, sharper. The entries weren't about cattle. They were about payments, donations, tithes. Bo flipped through page after page, his mouth tightening with each line. "Donation from J.M. for upkeep of moral order, $20. Church Restoration Fund, paid by E.C., amount $15. Special compensation for protection of town reputation, R.V., $50. And next to each, the same initials. P.V., he froze. Pastor Virgil. Bo shut the book too hard, dust flying into the lantern light like startled fireflies. He leaned against the stall door, heart pounding. It wasn't just pious cruelty or small-town fear that had fueled what happened to Raele. It was a business, a protection racket draped in sermons, and his family, his name, was linked to it. Because at the top of the donation columns, in that same scratchy hand, were the words, "Ledgers to be preserved at the Red Hawk barn per agreement." His barn. His land. Bo gritted his teeth and slammed the book down. He had spent years thinking his silence kept him apart from the rot of this town. But silence wasn't distance. It was complicity. Morning came with no warning, and Raele found him in the field, shirt off, sweat streaking his back as he tore apart the fence they'd just fixed. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm changing the path," he said, voice hard. "Cattle don't need to graze near the ridge anymore." "But you said I was wrong." His eyes flicked towards the town. Too close to rot. That night, over cold beans and warm firelight, he handed her the ledger. She read it silently, face unreadable. "This is proof," she whispered. They paid to ruin people like me. And my family let them store the receipts here, Bo said, his voice rough. Which means your name can fix what theirs broke, she said, eyes glowing with something fierce. If you wanted to. Bo didn't answer at first. They'll come after me, after you. They already did. She touched the wrapped wound on her palm, then looked up. I lost everything, except truth, and you showed me I still had that. Bo studied her a long moment, then nodded once. Not a vow. Not yet. But the start of something moving. That night, he built a second fire, far from the house, by the edge of the bluff, and burned every page except the one with the pastor's name, that he folded gently and placed inside the band of his hat. Before he slept, he whispered into the wind, not a prayer but a promise. You will not touch her again. And from the dark, a wind carried the scent of ash and old paper down toward the valley. Change had begun. They just didn't know it yet. The town of Elkhorn never liked loose threads, and Bo Redhawk was fast becoming one. Word spread quicker than prairie fire. First came curious glances from the general store porch, then silence at the blacksmith's when he entered, and finally, Pastor Virgil himself appeared on the ranch uninvited, riding a glossy bay with the kind of confidence that came from years of going unchallenged. Bo stood barefoot by the well, sleeves rolled, hands muddy from digging new post holes, when he saw the figure approaching. Raella watched from the kitchen window, her breath hitching as the preacher dismounted like a landowner inspecting damage. "Brother Redhawk," the pastor called, his voice oiled smooth. "We haven't seen you at service lately." "Didn't realize attendance was compulsory," Bo muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. The pastor chuckled, but his eyes were hard. "The community feels unsettled. The girl, her presence, it's raising questions." "Good," Bo said, turning back to the post hole. "Maybe they'll find answers." "Now, son," the pastor's voice dropped, "you know what's at stake. This ranch, your family's name. That ledger? It's not yours to parade. It was a sacred agreement." Bo drove the shovel into the earth with such force it struck stone. "Sacred like auctioning off shame? Like breaking a girl because the town's pride couldn't bear her silence?" "She was warned," the pastor snapped. "She defied us." "She mourned in mud," Bo growled, stepping closer, towering now. "And you called it sin." Virgil's jaw flexed. "I advise you to reconsider what you think you know. Burn that page. Send her away. There's still time to stay on the right side of the line." "You drew the line," Bo said, stepping back. "Now I'm moving the fence." That night they came. Not with torches or ropes. This was a modern cleansing. 4 men from the town council arrived with a deed, unsigned but laced with threat. A generous offer for the Red Hawk Ranch, complete with legal jargon and talk of her location assistance. Raelle stood behind Bo on the porch, her fingers digging into the back of his shirt. "You want the land?" Bo asked. "No," said the oldest of them. "We want her off it." "Why?" Raelle said, stepping forward. "Because I don't kneel when you pass?" "Because you remind folks what we did," the man said, "and you won't stay buried." Bo didn't answer. He took the deed, read it, then calmly tore it down the middle. "Tell Virgil if he wants the land, he can come with a shovel and dig up every post himself." "You'll regret this," one muttered. "Already did," Bo said. The men rode off in the dust. That night, Bo didn't speak much. Raelle found him in the barn, oiling the saddle of his father's old gelding. "You're going somewhere?" she asked. "To the courthouse," he said. "I'm filing for protective rights on this land. You'll be listed as family." She stared. "I'm not." "You are now," he said. "If they want to evict you, they'll have to evict me too." Rael sat on the haystack beside him, lips trembling. "They might burn it down, like they did to my father's house." Bo nodded. "Then I'll build it again, twice as strong." She touched the brim of his hat, where the folded ledger paper still rested. "You know they'll come harder now." "So will I," he said quietly. "And this time, I'll be ready." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The air between them was already made of promises, and somewhere beyond the barn, the wind shifted again. This time it blew toward town. The schoolhouse bell always rang at dawn, even on Sundays. But this morning, it rang at noon, and not from the tower, but from the hand of a trembling boy who sprinted through town, clanging the metal like a war cry. His name was Lucas Porter, freckles and dust, and he shouted a single phrase. They locked her inside. By the time Bo and Rael reached the schoolhouse, a crowd had already gathered. Not the whole town, just the ones who liked to look away while pretending they were helping. The school marm, Miss Adeline Croom, stood with her arms crossed and her lips pursed, refusing to meet Bo's eyes. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Inside," she said flatly. "It's for her own safety. Children were crying. She frightened them." "By doing what?" Rael asked, voice sharp. "Breathing." "She tried to speak," Adeline said, as if it were a crime, but not in a girl's tone, loud, director, like a man. "You know what that does to boys raised right?" Bo shoved past the onlookers, shoulder slamming the door open. The schoolroom was silent. On the back bench, slumped and shaking, was a little girl with mud-stained sleeves and tear-streaked cheeks. Delia, the girl who'd followed Rael from the graveyard. Raelle rushed to her, gathering her into her arms. "She just wanted to learn," Raelle whispered. "That's all." "She's not enrolled," Adeline snapped from the doorway. "And she can't be. She has no papers, no last name." Bo turned slowly, eyes colder than mountain ice. "You ever teach a war orphan, Adeline? You ever show long division to someone who's seen fire eat her roof? That's not the point. It is now." Bo walked to the blackboard and, with a sharp screech, wrote 4 words in thick white chalk. "School is for everybody." "You gonna erase that?" he asked. "Go ahead, but you'll do it in front of every child in this town. And when they ask why, you better have something holier than ink." No one moved. Not Adeline. Not the mayor, who had slunk in unnoticed, and especially not Raelle, who stood with Delia in her arms like a lioness with her cub. "They'll shut the school," someone muttered. "Fine," Bo said. "Then we'll teach in barns, in haylofts, on the back of wagons, but she's learning her letters if I have to carve the alphabet in stone." That afternoon, they brought chairs into the Red Hawk barn. Children came in 2s and 3s, some trailing behind hesitant mothers, others sneaking away from homes that didn't understand. Raelle stood before them, voice steady, chalk in hand. "A is for again," she said. "As in, we begin again. Right now." Delia sat in the front, eyes wide, her lips mouthing every letter silently. By sunset, even some of the elders had crept to the barn door, peering in like ghosts from a world that had passed them by. Bo didn't care. He stood by the entrance, arms crossed, hat low, guarding, watching, waiting. As Raelle turned from the makeshift blackboard, her eyes met his and something shifted. This wasn't just defiance, it was inheritance. They were carving a new place, not just for Delia, but for every daughter left behind in dust, every child told to speak soft or not at all. And Bo knew then. He hadn't saved Raelle. She was saving all of them. One letter at a time, one child at a time, one day at a time. The barn grew quiet as she wrote the last word on the board. Belong. And nobody dared erase it. The letter came folded 4 times, smudged with soot and tied with a piece of old ribbon. No address, no name, just the word "forgive" scratched across the front in a child's unsure hand. Rael found it tucked in the feed bin that morning while pouring oats for the horses. She opened it slowly, expecting something from Delia, perhaps another secret. Yet what she read made her knees nearly buckle. "To the woman who stood still in the rain," it began. "I saw you from the cart, the day they said I wasn't anyone's anymore. I wanted to speak, but the driver told me not to look back. He said I belonged to the state now. But I remembered your face, and the way your hands were open at your sides, like you were ready to catch someone who never fell. I think I was supposed to fall, but I didn't. I just broke slowly. I don't know if I'm your daughter. I don't know if I'm anything, but I remember you, and I hope you remember me." It wasn't signed, but Rael knew. Her heart didn't guess. It screamed. She stood still in that dusty barn, sunlight cracking through the wood like heaven insisting itself into the silence, and she stared at the letter until her tears blurred every word. Then she ran. Down the slope, past the stream, all the way to the orphan cart route, hoping the dust might still remember the wheels. Delia wasn't just a stranger's child. She was Rael's, stolen long ago, handed off to the state when Rael's fever had nearly killed her after childbirth. They'd told her the baby hadn't survived, but that was never true. The truth had sat in schoolhouse pews and cried for chalk and scratched out "forgive" with shaking fingers. Bo found her kneeling in the dirt, let her clutched like a lifeline, shoulders heaving. "What happened?" he asked softly. "She's mine," Rael whispered. "Delia is mine." Bo said nothing at first. He just knelt beside her, one hand on her back, the other gently taking the letter. He read it without asking permission, because some silences are allowed only between the closest of souls. When he finished, he looked out toward the hills and said, "We're not going to let her get lost again." That night, they lit lanterns across the fence posts, like a trail of fireflies meant to guide someone home. Children from the barn school came with candles. Elders came with old stories. And Raeli stood in the middle of it all, holding the ribbon from the letter like it was proof that hope had weight. Just after midnight, a figure appeared in the light, barefoot, shivering, but standing. It was Delia. She had seen the glow from the edge of town and walked alone through coyote dark trails to find it. Raeli ran to her, no hesitation, no doubt. She dropped to her knees in the dust and held her tight, mud and tears and all, and whispered, "Yes, I still can." Bo turned away then, just for a moment, wiping something from his cheek that he'd never admit was a tear. A barn bell rang somewhere in the distance, not from a tower, but from a child's hand. And just like that, every lie they'd told about who belonged and who didn't began to fall apart. Delia had come home, not to a house, but to a heart that had waited in silence for too long. And tomorrow, when school began again, there'd be no roll call, just a lesson on how love remembers, even when the world forgets. They found the preacher outside the schoolhouse, alone on the old porch bench, his hat in his lap and his hands trembling. Word had spread quicker than wildfire. The girl wasn't some street orphan or charity case. She was Rael's, flesh and blood. The daughter taken years ago by mistake, or by malice, and left to wander a system that never knew her name. The preacher didn't look up when Rael and Bo approached. He just kept staring at the dust beneath his boots, like it held some answer he hadn't prayed hard enough for. "You knew," Raeli said, her voice not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the morning fog. "You were there the day they told me she died. You read the scripture over an empty crib." The preacher flinched, then finally looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "I didn't know she lived," he whispered. "But I knew they lied. They said you were too sick. that you'd lost your mind from fever. They told me it was better to let the child be taken, that it would be safer. I didn't ask questions. I just obeyed." Bo stepped forward, but Rael put a hand on his arm. Her gaze never left the preacher. "You buried my baby with words you didn't believe," she said. "And then you let me walk through every Sunday with nothing but silence and fake comfort." The preacher closed his eyes, 2 tears falling like guilty ink on an old Bible. "I thought I was protecting the town," he said, "but I was just protecting myself and them, the people who think order is more sacred than truth." A wind kicked up, scattering hymn pages someone had forgotten on the porch rail. One sheet landed at Raele's feet. She picked it up, read the title, "Blessed are the Broken," and held it there for a second. "You'll come to the school today," she said. "You'll tell Delia and the other children. Tell them what happens when grown men confuse silence for safety." The preacher nodded slowly. "Will she forgive me?" he asked. Raele's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. "That's not for me to say, but I can tell you this. You're going to start trying, with every word you've got left." The schoolhouse bell rang just then, sharp and sweet. Delia was already inside, sitting in the front row, her chin lifted like she was trying to grow taller just by believing she belonged. When the preacher stepped through the doorway an hour later, every child went quiet. He walked to the front, took off his hat, and didn't open the Bible. Instead, he placed it down and said, "Before I speak of grace, I need to speak of guilt." He told the truth, not just about Delia, but about every girl whose name had been erased, every boy sent off because he didn't fit the mold. He spoke until his throat went raw and his hands trembled again, but this time from something like release. When it was over, Delia didn't say anything. She just stood, walked to the front, and placed her hand on his. It was small, quiet, but it shattered something inside him. And maybe, just maybe, it started building something new. Raela watched from the doorway, Bo beside her, both of them knowing this wasn't a fix, but it was a beginning. In the corner of the room, a tiny chalk drawing had appeared on the board. A woman in the rain, arms open wide, and a little girl walking toward her. No face, just 2 shadows drawn in love. And beneath it, 3 words in trembling cursive, "Still can hug." Bo had seen war, betrayal, and nights so cold your thoughts froze before your breath did. But nothing rattled him like watching Delia carry that tin plate of biscuits down to the old boarding house where her foster mother still sat on the porch like a spider in a rocking chair. Rael stood behind her, not interfering, not instructing, just letting the girl walk her own steps toward closure. Delia didn't speak when she reached the porch. She simply placed the plate on the railing and looked the woman in the eye. The woman, Elsbeth, narrowed her gaze, expecting vengeance, maybe shame. But Delia didn't flinch. "You won't see me again," she said, her voice low but even. "But you'll remember that I left you food, that I left better than you treated me." Elsbeth's lip curled, but her hands trembled as they reached for the warm plate. By then, Bo had stepped forward, tall and unblinking. "You ever so much as look at another child the wrong way," he said quietly. "I'll make sure the law don't get there before I do." And he meant it, not in anger, but in that quiet Apache way that turns words into weather. Delia turned and walked back without a backward glance. That night, under a quilt made by schoolchildren who barely knew her name, but had each stitched one thread of hope, Delia leaned into Rael's arms. "Do I still belong to the dust?" she whispered. Rael smiled into her hair. "You belong to everything that grew after the storm." They'd planted a rose bush outside the school earlier that day. It wasn't tradition, just impulse. Raelle had dug the hole herself, hands blistered, nails cracked, while Bo stood silently beside her with a watering can. They hadn't spoken much, but his presence had said more than 100 sermons. When Delia dropped the first seed in, the whole school clapped, not because they understood what it meant, but because they felt something new beginning. The next morning, Raelle walked to the church alone, not to pray, to reclaim. She lit a single candle for the child she was told had died, and then blew it out, smiling. Not out of defiance, but freedom. On her way out, the preacher handed her a folded paper. It was a birth record. Delia's, finally corrected. "She's yours," he said. "Always was." Outside, Bo waited with 2 horses saddled and silent. "Where to?" he asked. Raelle looked down the road, then back toward the town that had bruised and broken her more times than she could count. But this time, she didn't feel heavy. "Home," she said, "wherever she feels safe." As they rode, Delia behind her and Bo beside them, the wind caught Raelle's hat and flung it into the sky. Delia gasped, but Raelle laughed. "Let it go," she said. "We got more than enough to hold on to now." Behind them, the rose bush had started to bloom, not in red, but in pale gold, like morning light, like something finally healed. And on the school's front door, someone had pinned a note. Just 3 words. "She is ours." They never found out who wrote it. Didn't need to. Some stories don't need names, just endings. And some hugs, no matter how muddy or broken, last longer than words, longer than dust, longer than silence. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more frontier stories from Echoes of the West. If you had seen her, caked in mud and shame, would you have held her too? Or walked away?